He who pays the bills controls the agenda, and agenda control may be the most underrated form of power out there. By now, you have already heard about the deal between the United States and NATO allies to send American materiel to Ukraine. It was a major development because the United States has some military technologies that Europe cannot adequately replicate, and the deal ensures their continued flow to Ukraine after plenty of speculation for the last few months that the United States might completely withdraw. Now, if there is any criticism about it coming from the West, the complaints focus on the transactional nature of the agreement. The myopic interpretation of things is that the United States merely opened a storefront. Here is the warehouse, Europe. Come in and buy what you need. Sure, that is better than the alternative for Europe, where the warehouse is closed, and Ukraine does not have access to weapons technology that only the United States can provide. But this is not the United States warmly engaging with Ukraine, and that distinction might matter. Instead, it's the Trump administration, still preferring to pivot to the Indo-Pacific, receiving some cash to make some exceptions. And I am not here to convince you otherwise. That is exactly what is happening. However, it is unclear whether that is actually worse than the United States being a more active participant. Let me explain. Forgetting about China for the moment, the Trump administration and European allies do not have the same goals regarding Ukraine. Europe is primarily interested in a good outcome for Kyiv and pushing back Russian gains as far as possible, perhaps with some Russian attrition along the way. Meanwhile, the Trump administration is primarily concerned about reaching a ceasefire, followed by a long-term end to the war. These are not the same thing. That much should be evident. What is not as obvious is that if your policy tool to get the outcome that you want is to give military aid to Ukraine, the kind of aid you ought to give to Ukraine will differ depending on your goal. Now, I am not going to pretend that I understand the White House's strategic thinking on this. Nor can I tell you that I know that Europe is already planning to take advantage of the situation in the manner that I am about to talk about. It is also unclear exactly how the United States and Europe will agree to sales, but I am going under the impression that Europe can pick and choose what it wants to buy. And what I will do with the rest of this video is explain what Europe would be best off sending to Ukraine given its goals, and how that differs from what the White House wants, but has also abrogated control over. To be clear, this is not just an intercontinental divide that we are witnessing here. There is also a divide in the media coverage on the subject. Left-leaning sources focused on the deal in relation to the quality of the war outcomes. Meanwhile, right-leaning sources instead emphasized Europe accepting a greater burden-sharing role in international security. How do I know all of this? Well, it is thanks to our returning sponsor, Ground News. They make staying on top of the news easy by allowing you to curate your feed with the topics that are most important to you, all while making sure that you know where you are getting your news from so that you receive accurate reporting. And by going to ground.news/linesonmaps or scanning the QR code on your screen, you can get a 40% discount on a Vantage plan. That is how I get all of these insights and more. So thanks again to Ground News for their continuing support of this channel. Today's story is all about bargaining dynamics, so let's start there. If you have been listening to my voice for the last 3 years, 1, I am so sorry, and 2, you already know that war is the consequence of bargaining failure. If you want to know why it starts, you have to understand the source of the bargaining failure. And if you want it to end, you have to resolve the source of the bargaining failure. You know the drill. Take a hypothetical expected outcome of a war, then represent Ukraine's costs of fighting in terms of square kilometers drawn a certain distance west of that expected outcome. Then do the same for Russia, but going east. Then, boom, you have a range of settlements that are better for both parties than the war. The Trump administration's goal is to get the parties to concur on what that expected outcome is, and to further agree that it will not change over time. Europe, on the other hand, has a different goal. There are many different settlements that could be implemented conditional on such recognition, and some of those are better for Ukraine than others. Europe wants Ukraine to obtain one of the better ones. Moreover, resetting to the military basics, there is no saying that you must keep those boundary lines of the feasible settlements where they currently are. If you empower Ukraine, the whole bargaining range moves in a direction favorable to Ukraine, and therefore Europe. If you better protect Ukrainian cities, then Ukraine pays a lower cost, and that prevents Russia from trying to negotiate along the worst edge. And if you impose greater costs on Russia, the Kremlin will hesitate to continue the war. Thus, it opens up new potential settlements along the best edge for Ukraine. However, in conjunction with bargaining frictions, such actions might facilitate negotiations, or might make them more difficult. Let me give you an applied example of these ideas in action. The friction that we have talked about the most over the last year is Ukraine's inability to hold defensive fortifications in the east. There may very well be others. Russia's overestimation of its capacity, private benefits for the Kremlin to continue the war, maybe even more beyond those. However, the arms recommendations would be different for each of those, and would convolute the overall lesson that I am trying to convey here. Namely, that the United States has granted Europe the ability to dictate the pace of the war. Back to the fortifications issue, this is not a disaster for Ukraine. After all, Russia is struggling to move the line at a reasonable pace, but that can still leave behind a bargaining problem. Suppose that Russia thinks that if it continues fighting uninterrupted, then the war will end with a division like this. Factoring in its costs, Russia will not accept a deal anything short of here. There are layers to the impending problem. If Ukraine were to try to implement that expected outcome, it would effectively render the defensive entrenchments that it currently has irrelevant, and Russia would make substantial gains without seeing any attrition in its ranks. That would instantaneously change the expected outcome of the war to something further west, leading to yet further minimal demands from Russia. And conceding on those new minimal demands may lead to yet further problems. This is essentially the same issue that the Munich Agreement had more than 80 years ago. It rendered defensive fortifications in Czechoslovakia irrelevant and allowed Hitler to acquire more. So, rather than going down that spiral, Ukraine needs to continue fighting and draining the Kremlin's resources. It may expect to continue bleeding land, but an attrited Russian army does not cause the same kind of domino problems as simply giving up the territory. The other part of the problem is with talks of a ceasefire. The issue here is that a ceasefire gives Ukraine time to work on its defensive fortifications. If the point of a ceasefire is to build up toward a finalized settlement, the delay therefore alters the expected outcome of the war in a manner favorable to Ukraine if the war should restart following a failed ceasefire negotiation. In turn, the Kremlin wants to do everything in its power to continue the pressure, maintain the initiative, and prevent Ukraine from solidifying the front lines. That said, these types of problems exist to some degree in every war ever fought. Despite that, the vast majority of them end in some type of negotiated settlement. Okay, why? Well, I can point to two things in this case. First is the extent of the domino effect. Imagine that this is the expected outcome of the war if fought to a complete conclusion. And let's suppose that you implement that as the settlement. Russia then moves all of its forces over to here. Sure, if you restart the war at that point, the new expected outcome may look a little different. But perhaps Russia's supply lines get massively stretched at this point, or there are topographical features that make it difficult to go any further. Then the new expected outcome does shift westward, but not by much, and critically, certainly not beyond the realm of what Ukraine's value of war net costs are in the present. Thus, smaller shifts in the balance of power post-settlement are good for peace. So are larger costs of war. On Ukraine's end, it may tolerate more of a domino effect if the alternative is close to the destruction of the entire country. Meanwhile, on Russia's end, higher costs are helpful there too. That is because the Kremlin is willing to settle for less at the start, potentially including something that resembles the current line of control. If you are where you are, then there is no domino effect to speak of. Now let's bring these points together and see the clear differences in the paths that the United States and Europe have toward their goals. If your goal is to maximize the chances of peace, you want to do three things: mitigate the shift in the balance of power caused by trying to implement a settlement, increase Ukraine's cost of war, and increase Russia's cost of war. Meanwhile, if your goal is to maximize the quality of the outcome for Ukraine, you want to increase Ukraine's ability to win the war, mostly regardless of what it does to post-settlement shifts in the balance of power, decrease Ukraine's cost of war, and increase Russia's cost of war. Thus, the only strategy that overlaps between the two goals is to increase Russia's cost of war. Altering Ukraine's cost of war will help one of those strategies and hurt the other, and aiding Ukraine may or may not help reach a settlement, depending on its effects on post-settlement shifts. With those effects in mind, let's look at some of the weapons that Ukraine might receive from Europe via the United States. Patriots are a good place to start, given all of the public attention to them over the last couple of weeks. What do Patriots do? Primarily, they stop incoming ballistic missiles from striking Ukrainian cities. Thus, they are reducing Ukraine's costs of war. So, great for Ukraine's welfare, and also good for Europe. But look over here. In terms of purely ending the war regardless of the distributive outcome, it is not so great, and thus not so great for the United States. I have a whole bunch of caveats here, though. First, as we covered last week, countries internalize costs relative to how much they care about the issues at stake. Ukraine, fighting for its sovereign existence, values those stakes highly. In turn, Kyiv internalizes every unit of costs at a relatively low rate. As such, Patriots may indeed have a tangible effect on the raw costs suffered, but they will have a disproportionately small effect on coercive bargaining. Meanwhile, and something else that I recently talked about over on Lines on Maps Extra this time, Patriots are an awful way to counter drone attacks. And right now, Russia's main method to attack Ukrainian cities is to send over waves of Shahed-style drones. Perhaps the most promising solution is to develop anti-drone drones. However, the US-NATO weapons-sharing plan is unlikely to help much with that. Ukraine is the current hub of innovation in the drone warfare sector within the West, so simple cash transfers to fund more investment there may yield better results. Third, it is not entirely clear that the Trump administration is aware of this counter-incentive, or whether anyone in the White House cares at this point. Patriots are the one thing that the Trump administration keeps trumpeting, and it seems that the United States is even pushing aside Swiss orders to prioritize Ukraine. Finally, there is the complication of how US aid here is supposed to be conditional on Ukraine staying on board with the ceasefire plan, which ought to mitigate some of the negative effects on peace that I mentioned earlier. Or at least that is how the Kellogg peace plan was designed. I am not entirely sure that the United States is still on track with it at this point, or if Trump reached a boiling point with Putin, and would prefer if Melania switched conversation topics to anything other than Ukrainian cities getting destroyed. Anyway, how about long-range attack options? I mention this because of a report that Trump asked Zelensky whether he could hit high-value Russian targets if provided the weaponry, to which Zelensky obviously said, "Yeah, I think we can do that." But then Trump followed up by saying that he was not in favor of doing such things. I think it is worth noting here that details on weapons heading to Ukraine via the US-NATO deal are scant. One reason that might be the case is that they do not want to telegraph any tactical information to Russia, so I would take any denials at this point with a grain of salt. Instead, for a hypothetical discussion, What happens if the United States opens up the vault to something like a reserve supply of ATACMS or Tomahawk missiles? Well, that would depend on what Ukraine does next with them, or what the United States approves their use for. If Ukraine targets Russia's drone factories and supply chains, then this is just a complicated way to reduce Ukraine's costs of war. We end up back at the same conclusions that we drew a moment ago. Good for Ukraine and good for Europe. Actually, perhaps very good for Europe. There may not be a better return on investment in terms of enhancing Ukraine's bargaining power than disabling Russian drone factories, despite my earlier caveat about Ukrainian resolve. The trick, of course, is that the factories are large and far away. Consequently, a successful attack would likely require a substantial number of Tomahawk missiles. That, in turn, would raise the specter of Russia responding against Western targets. No, not in the nuclear sense. That would be a bad idea for the Kremlin. But you might start seeing more effort put into gray zone or covert activities on European soil. Alternatively, if Ukraine would use those weapons to hammer high-value Russian targets, then Russia's cost of war inflates. There is now a convergence between the two goals. A settlement is more likely, and it will be favorable to Ukraine. Or Ukraine starts hitting Russia's traditional weaponry meant to move the front lines. Well, that changes the expected outcome favorably for Ukraine. Good for Europe, but a nebulous effect for the United States. Let's look at a couple of lesser discussed options, starting with artillery. Imagine that Europe goes all in on shipping every last 155mm artillery shell out there. The 155mm is best used to soften an opposing side on the front lines, which thereby stifles any attacks that the opponent may pursue. Clearly, that has a positive effect on Ukraine's ability to win the war, so that is looking good from Europe's perspective. But do you know what else stifling a Russian attack does? It buys Ukraine time to establish solidified front lines, which also resolves part of the bargaining problem. And that is a win for the Trump administration's goal of reaching a settlement. However, if you think about the rate of return, this looks much better for Europe than it does for the White House. Military power is military power for Ukraine, and you do not need to overinterpret that much here. In contrast, artillery transfers are a crude way to try to resolve the bargaining problem. Ukraine, for example, might look at the softened Russian lines and prioritize counterattacks. That is good for Ukraine again, and therefore good for Europe. But it does not resolve the long-run problem of establishing entrenchments that will uphold a ceasefire. Hence, this is a benefit that the United States loses by foregoing the agenda control. Because if the United States were choosing what to send over, I could find something better. Indeed, the aforementioned issue runs in contrast to the last type of equipment that I want to talk about today: excavators. This is not normally what you think of when you hear the word materiel, but they sure can build a trench much faster than you or I could with a shovel. It is still true that Ukraine having good entrenchments improves Ukraine's expected outcome of the war, so chalk that up as another win for Europe. But all they can do here is build trenches. They are not going to soften up Russia's side of the battlefield. Thus, this is a bigger win for trying to resolve the bargaining friction. And maybe in practice you need a mix of artillery and excavators, so that the former can buy breathing room to use the latter. But the breakdown between the two is something that the United States has ceded control over by handing the agenda-setting power to Europe. Now, we could go on for days talking about what every weapon system does. We could also talk about how all sorts of other bargaining frictions exist, and how they would change the favored transfers for Europe and the United States. But you get the basic point. I will leave it to the actual policymakers to dance through the details, while we work on thanking Ground News for once again sponsoring today's video. Go to ground.news/linesonmaps, or scan the QR code on your screen to take 40% off a Vantage plan. And if you enjoyed today's video, please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.